Hi, this is Professor Davenport. I'm here with Bryan Dean, reporter for the Oklahoman. And today we're going to be discussing the role of the media in our political system, the issues of transparency, and a little bit about some of the challenges facing the media coming up in the future. Bryan, thanks for being with us today.
No problem.
From your perspective, what's the most important role that the media plays in our political system?
Well, and this has been true since, 1776. I mean, we established a form of government where the media plays a watchdog role, and that is really the role we play in the media is to just be an outside watchdog. There are checks and balances within government and everything, but from the outset, the founders viewed the media, the press, as a way to essentially keep tabs on the government from the outside, keep people informed about what's going on, and let people know when the government's getting out of hand, essentially.
Now, the way the media fulfills that role has kind of changed over time. Can you talk a little bit about how that has changed over the past few decades?
Well, the past few decades have been, it's a combination of technology and then just the evolution of politics, I think, in our country. I mean, I think there's two major things. One is the technology side of things, and it's not just the internet. One of the biggest things that affected the way the media operates is the 24-hour news cycle that came with the cable news channels. Sure. When CNN came along, when MSNBC and Fox News came along, and you have these 24-hour news cycles where they have to fill 24 hours of programming, whether there's 24 hours of quality news to put out there or not. So what you get is a lot more opinion disguised as news, things where the line is blurred. And that technology side of it has been one side of it. The other side is, and this I think people forget a lot, is politicians have gotten a lot better at clouding the media's role as watchdog. The time was a guy like Edward R. Murrow, who was a famous broadcaster in the 50s, and essentially brought down, what's his name, the
McCarthy.
McCarthy, and the McCarthy hearings. He wouldn't be able to get away with that today because Murrow had a gravitas with the public where he was a respected arbiter. The thing now is that politicians have figured out how to drag the media into the mud, basically accuse us of being biased, never admit to anything, and essentially make the media part of the political mud wrestling to the point where now people don't trust the media as an arbiter, an outside arbiter. They think we are, either bought and paid for or biased one way or another, to the point where, it's hard for us to get a word out that people will necessarily trust all the time.
Sure. You mentioned technology, and we know that the internet and social media has had a huge impact on how the media in general perform their role, but how has it impacted how individual reporters such as yourself really communicate with the public and with government officials?
There's positives and negatives to the internet, and I think one of the great things is that I can't imagine doing this job without the internet. I mean, when I started in high school, the internet was a new thing. As a journalist, I worked on my high school newspaper. I can't imagine doing the job I do every day without it. It's so much easier to find information quickly, to find people quickly. If something happens in a neighborhood, I can use databases and find neighbors and such very fast. Without the internet, that would be really hard. Communicating with the public just in general, social media. If I need to find somebody, if I'm working on a story and I need a person who fits into a certain category, I can put the word out on Twitter and Facebook and often find somebody that way. We can find, again, relatives. I've been working on a story about an Oklahoma recent graduate of the class in School of Advanced Studies who went missing in Ecuador.
Yes.
And we're able to keep in touch with his family in Ecuador through email. We're able to reach relatives through Facebook. There are a couple different Facebook pages where people are posting updates from Ecuador in Spanish. These are the kinds of things that we get real-time updates now on those sorts of things. And it's both a way for us to communicate. I can promote what I'm doing to the public, but also for the public to communicate with us and get in touch with us much faster, for us to get information much faster. The bad side is that it does clutter things up. Everybody now essentially owns their own printing press. When you have Twitter and Facebook, everybody can put information out there, and it does somewhat clutter the landscape, so to speak.
Right. And switching gears for just a second, we hear a lot from public officials and from those in the media and in other places about this notion of transparency in government. And I know this has been an issue that you're very passionate about and you work on quite a bit. Can you kind of explain what is meant by transparency in government? And then what are some of the open government or open records laws, both at the state and federal level? What is their importance to ensuring transparency?
Well, the concept of transparency in government is pretty simple. It's just that the government does its business in the open. Mm-hmm. The Congress meets in the open. People from the public can go in and watch the proceedings. They're recorded. Minutes are taken. Mm-hmm. Meetings are published ahead of time so that people know when they're going to meet and what they're going to talk about. If you want to go review the checkbook, so to speak, if you want to go look at the money that your government is spending, you're able to do that through records laws. You can go and request, all of the pay stubs essentially, and just take a look at where they're spending their money. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what transparency means. It's just that the business of the government is done in the public so that those who are paying for it through their tax money can see what's going on. You've paid for this stuff. So as far as the laws that are out there, there's different laws for federal and state. There's a federal law, which is the Freedom of Information Act, which is often referred to as FOIA. Mm-hmm. And that is basically how you request records from the federal government. You submit a request, and they have a certain amount of time to respond. To be honest, the federal law is a bit lacking. It takes oftentimes months or years to get records. If it's something simple, often you can get it fast, but there are lots of cases where members of the public or the media have made FOIA requests, and agencies have, because of the way the law works and how long they're given to respond and go back and forth, it can take a long time to get the information you want. At the state level in Oklahoma, we have the State Open Records Act, mm-hmm. and then the State Open Meeting Act. And the Open Meeting Act is basically just requires, again, that all meetings are open to the public, and that there are agendas printed ahead of time, so nothing's sprung on people. You don't go in there and they just all of a sudden decide on a whim to discuss putting up a jail in your backyard. Essentially, if that's going to be discussed in a meeting, they have to put it on an agenda ahead of time so that people who are concerned about the issue can come and give their input. Essentially, be able to see what their government's doing. Right. There's requirements on notification, how long they have to notify. They're supposed to post a calendar of all meetings a year ahead of time. And then if they have to have emergency meetings and such, say there's a tornado and they need to allocate money to deal with that, there are provisions for that as well. Okay. The Open Records Act pertains more, again, to obviously written records. And what it essentially says is that records held by the state and local governments are open unless stated otherwise. And so there are some exemptions in there for different sorts of things, privacy things. There are several different types of exemptions, but the records are presumed open. So if you want to go in and get a record, an agenda, anything like that, it's considered open. Anything involving the expenditure of funds, it's open record. You can go in as a private citizen, as a member of the media, whatever, and say, I would like to see this document, essentially.
And when it comes to records, we talk about records and we tend to think of forms and stuff, but emails can be considered open records, right?
And this law was obviously established before the internet, but it covers everything. It covers audio recordings, it covers video, it covers, so you can go in and take a blank DVD. If they videotape a meeting and they don't put it on the internet, you can take them a blank DVD and say, I would like a copy of that, and or they can charge you the cost of a blank DVD if they're going to make a copy of it. It covers the internet. If they post information on the internet, that's open record. Emails, and not just the emails they send from their public accounts. Some of the more recent rulings in many states, including ours, have said that if a public official, say the governor, has a private Gmail account, and they're conducting public business on their Gmail account, they're emailing constituents, they're emailing other legislators, they're emailing lobbyists, those are still conducting public business. It's basically it's not the briefcase you take it in, right? It's the document inside. So if you're conducting public business, that's an open record.
Perhaps a good warning for public officials to make sure that they know when their communication might be considered an open.
Well, I personally would like them not to be warned because, frankly, lots of times requesting emails from people, you find they don't realize that this could be looked at later, and they say things that they otherwise wouldn't. So personally, I'd be happy to keep that a little quiet until we need them, because that way it gives us better stories.
Sure. Well, on that point, you seem to have a lot of times public officials who will talk about transparency and how much they want it, how much they believe in it. But going back to what you said, sometimes when it's them, they want to drag their feet. So what's this dichotomy, if you will, of on one side, yes, we want it, on the other side, well, we can't get it as fast as we should.
Government transparency is really popular. All government officials love transparency. That doesn't mean that they actually either know what it means or love it when it really comes to them.
Sure.
I'm the past president of Freedom of Information Oklahoma, which is an organization that's dedicated to advocating for open government. Mm-hmm. And we've done open government pledges where we have candidates who will sign these and say, I will respect and conform with both the law, the spirit, and the letter of the law. Mm-hmm. Governor Mary Fallon signed one of those when she was running for governor. Didn't stop her from deciding later on that her emails are executive privilege, even though that's not covered in our law. And that's the kind of thing that, it makes that example. Everybody likes transparency in theory, mm-hmm. but when they realize that their information might be public, they start to have a double take. I think it's very easy. And to be fair, there are things that they're concerned about constituent communication, and they say, well, if I have to divulge everything somebody sends me from the public, my constituents won't want to get in contact with me. Mm-hmm. And so there are some valid concerns that are dealt with in our laws. But the thing is that those sorts of valid concerns are addressed in the law, and if the legislature finds another one, they can always add that into the Open Records Act as well.
Sure. And
there are bills every year that amend the Open Records Act and the Open Meeting Act. So there are provisions for that, but again, we find this all the time where government officials say, oh, I love transparency, I'm open, I'm all for openness, and then when it comes to actually practicing it, not so much.
Well, let's talk about something that's kind of in the news today, the case of Edward Snowden. Now, depending on who you talk to, he's either a traitor and a criminal, or he's someone who wanted to ensure that there was transparency in what the government was doing. What's your take on this whole issue, and how does it relate to both transparency as well as privacy issues?
Well, I think, I'm not going to go into whether or not I think he's a criminal or not, mm-hmm. because, he may very well have violated laws, I don't know. What I do know is we as a people, the American public, has to have a discussion. We have to have an ongoing discussion about the balance between privacy and security. Mm-hmm. The president said as much. After this all came out, he said, look, we need to have this discussion. I'm happy to have it.
Right.
Here's the problem. Without Edward Snowden's, we can't have that discussion. When you have these programs that are entirely secret, we don't know the scope of them, we don't know what they're collecting, we don't know anything about them. We can't have an honest debate about these types of programs. So I find it a bit disingenuous when the president says, I want to have an open and honest debate about secrecy and privacy and, openness in government, and yet they're going to go prosecute this guy who tried to put that information out so we could have that discussion. And he may have violated the law. And we as the media need people like Edward Snowden who are willing to blow the whistle, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But they do put themselves at risk, because oftentimes if you're in a position like him or a Bradley Manning, leaking information might be a violation of the law. Mm-hmm. Now the question comes in is that leak valuable enough to the American people that perhaps we should consider that any crime or any law that's being violated maybe is not worth as much as we're getting the information from.
Sure.
So I would say that the existence of these programs that are gathering phone and internet data from the public deserves to have that honest, open discussion, mm-hmm. and they can't have it if all this stuff is done in secret. If we don't know what our government's doing, we can't debate what our government's doing and find out what we agree with and come to a decision as a country on those sorts of things.
It has often been the case throughout our history that people have done things like this, and yes, they may have broken the law in doing it, but it ends out being for the greater good that they did so.
The Pentagon Papers are a great example of that. And this is obviously before my time, but back during the Vietnam War, a government official leaked what was called the Pentagon Papers. It was essentially a big long report on the Vietnam War that basically said we're losing. And not only are we losing, but it doesn't look like we can turn it around. And of course, government officials have been telling the public, oh no, it's going great, it's going great. Well, they tried to actually, the government tried to keep newspapers from printing segments from the Pentagon Papers ahead of time in what we call prior restraint. And the courts ruled you can't do that. If they publish it after the fact and something in there was classified and you want to go after someone, you can do that. But the government's been very clear that you cannot prior restrain what the media is able to publish. But that was another good example of, you can make a good argument that that report had enough news value and that the public needed to see and hear what was in that paper and that report, to the point where whatever law that whistleblower was violating was probably less important than the public interest in seeing that information.
Going back to a comment you made earlier, there's always these charges of media bias. I'm sure you've dealt with that before as well.
Oh yeah.
And really, I tell my classes, the simple way of understanding media bias is if you print something as a reporter that I don't like, you're biased. Because it doesn't agree with what I think. But how does this notion of bias continue to perpetuate itself? And do people tend to think of the media as one big monolithic block that just walks in lockstep, when it's really a very diverse group of reporters and editors who make decisions, every day based on what they think is going to be best for both themselves, their publication, what's the public going to want?
Right, and I think it's a very big subject, and I think there's several things that are at play here. Number one, I talked earlier about how the internet has broadened the media landscape. It's done that to the point where whatever you want from the media you can get, and whatever pseudo media you want to read, that's out there too. So yes, the media is extremely broad. It's not monolithic. It's not a new, the concept of the media being biased is not new. People have been making these charges for years and years, but it's gotten way worse in recent decades. And I think part of that is, I think as a country, people have taken the approach that they want the media to reinforce their worldview. And they want to hear information that will reinforce their worldview. And if the facts don't agree with their worldview, they don't want to hear them. And so they'll claim bias. And that's just become, and I blame both the media and politicians for helping and aiding this. As I said, there's been a conscious decision on the part of politicos in the past several decades to say, let's just drag the media down the mud with us and let's muddy the waters, where they aren't an outside arbiter anymore. The media has helped in that by doing some irresponsible things over the years. And it's out there. Media, the press is free if you can afford to buy one. Has always been the saying. Ownership of media can decide what to print and not, both on editorial pages in newspapers and in the news that's printed as well. What stories they decide to cover can be a bias, and that's true with TV. It's true with internet. It's true all the way down the line. But again, you have diverse enough media ownership, and I think what people tend to forget is, journalists, people who go into journalism, look, we don't get rich in this business. We're one of the lowest paid majors out of college. People don't get into this business because they have an axe to grind. If they did, they'd go into politics. People go into journalism because they want to be a watchdog. They want to inform the public. So for the most part, I think accusations of bias on reporters tend to be a bit overblown. Most reporters just want to do a good job. They want to get good stories. They want the truth to get out there. And again, there's bad eggs in both in government, and there are bad reporters too who do a bad job. But in general, I think most reporters want to help. When it comes to ownership, you do have to look at media ownership and decide, where that's coming from. And we see that. And again, when it comes to the cable news networks, you have one cable news network that's decided it wants to essentially be the voice for a more conservative part of the country, and you have another network that's decided it wants to sort of be the more progressive side, and so both of them cater essentially to those two sides. And then you have CNN that's kind of in the middle and tries to play the middle ground, but goes on one way or the other sometimes. They all have these opinion things that kind of blur what news is. So I'm not saying there's no bias out there, but I do think people have a not a great understanding of how bias comes into play, when it comes into play, And for the most part, what you read in a newspaper or see on TV from a reporter, they're trying to do a good job.
Right.
That's what they're trying to do. That's what we want to do. I'm not out to, I'm colored by what I see. If I go and I cover, city government, and I find that there's a city council member who is crooked, well, you damn better believe I'm going to go after that guy. But that's not, I'm a human being. I try to have good relationships with people. So it's not something where we go in and we necessarily have an axe to grind. It's not how journalists operate.
Speaking on that, this kind of notion is this plethora of information. Just the fact that there's so much more access to information. And if you could advise my students, what's one good way of trying to sort through where they can get reliable information? Obviously, some sources are better than others.
Right. I think what you have to do, first and foremost, when I talked about the concept of looking for information that suits your worldview, don't do that. You have got to recognize that we are all predisposed to it. And that's not just in news. If you're a fan of, the OU Sooners, and you're going to go search for, coverage of the OU Sooners is flattering. People don't want to hear they might stink this year in football. So if our sports reporters say they might stink this year, they're accused of being biased,
right,
even if it's true. And I think people just have a tendency to try. They want to hear what they want to hear. They don't go out and search out information that might tell them what they don't want to hear. So that's the first thing, is to not have that mentality, to fight that mentality, to just go out and find sources of information that are going to validate your worldview. Try to get a diverse, sense of things, and look at the sources. There is a reason that we have journalism schools in this country, and that people who are professional journalists, look, it's not easy to do by any stretch. So while there may be a blogger or somebody with a Twitter feed you trust, you have to go back and check the sources on that information. If someone's a professional journalist, hopefully you can have a little bit more faith in what they're doing. But the other thing is, we have so much access now through the internet to primary sources. You can check what you hear. If someone tells you that such and such bill is going to say this, go look at it yourself. It's easy to do these days. So check those primary sources of information. Check Snopes, check PolitiFact, check FactCheck. These are organizations that are dedicated to sorting out what's fact and what's a lie. And PolitiFact won a Pulitzer Prize for doing this. And yes, they're run by a newspaper, but you have to at some point trust that there are some people who go out and research these things.
Right.
And when you see something on the internet, don't just assume it's correct and repost it.
Right.
This is one of the most common sources of bad information these days are chain emails and posts on Facebook from quotes that aren't true and such like that. So go out and search for those things. Just try to fact check it yourself, and try to search out, if not a very diverse, set of sources, at least sources that have some credibility behind them.
Right.
And some accountability. That's the other thing. If you're a major news organization, there's some accountability behind what you do. If you're some nameless blogger who's not even putting out their first name, well, you're a little bit freer to say whatever the heck you want without getting sued for libel, for example.
Well, Bryan, thank you for visiting with us. We sure appreciate it, and I know my students will appreciate the conversation as well. And look forward to reading some of your stories in the future.
All right. Well, thanks, James. We appreciate it.